Rain fell over the Dutch East Indies like a memory that refused to fade. In the lowlands of Java, 1945, the monsoon beat against rusted barbed wire and sagging bamboo fences. Inside, hundreds of women, once teachers, nurses, mothers, stood barefoot in mud that swallowed their steps. The camp smelled of smoke, boiled roots, and rain-soaked decay. They had been here for 3 years, prisoners of an empire that demanded their silence and their obedience. They were the forgotten daughters of the Indies, and their war had not yet ended. Their captors called it protective custody. The women called it survival. At dawn, they lined up before a bamboo flagpole as Japanese soldiers barked orders in clipped syllables. They bowed, heads low, to a flag they did not believe in. The act was called tenko, and refusal meant the butt of a rifle or a night in the punishment pit. Some bowed with eyes open, unbroken. Others with eyes closed, imagining home, imagining the red roofs of Batavia, the cinnamon air of Surabaya, the sound of Dutch church bells across colonial streets that no longer existed. Food was a rumor. Each day brought a cup of rice water and a handful of wilted greens, sometimes mixed with insects for protein. The women learned to boil banana peels, grind dry corn husks, and chew each bite 50 times before swallowing. Dysentery ran through the camp like a ghost that chose a new body each week. Yet they adapted with quiet genius. Strips of mosquito net became sewing thread. Broken glass became mirrors. One woman used charcoal to write psalms on her child's palm, because paper was forbidden and faith had to hide. There was no medicine, but there was memory. They recited poems, sang lullabies in whispers, traded words like currency. "One day," said a woman named Johanna, her hair now cut short and gray from malnutrition, "we'll eat bread again. And butter. And laugh so loud the guards will think thunder's returned." Her tone wasn't hopeful, it was defiant. She had seen her husband taken away, her eldest son vanish into a camp upriver, yet she kept a single strand of his hair tied in cloth around her wrist. In that small act, resistance survived. The youngest among them were children born behind wire, babies who never saw freedom, who grew up knowing the world as bamboo and mud. They learned early to keep silent when footsteps approached, to hide scraps of sugar in the dirt floor, to move like shadows. Mothers, skeletal but fierce, traded portions of their meals to keep those children alive. "If they live," one woman said, "then we still exist." Survival became the only rebellion left. At night, the jungle came alive with frogs and insects and the far-off hum of bombers. Sometimes the sky pulsed red, American raids on Japanese airfields nearby. The women would watch, breathless, as fire traced patterns above the trees. "Maybe that's them," someone would whisper. "The Americans." It sounded almost mythical, that name. They'd heard rumors, radio fragments, smuggled news from a captured nurse, that the Allies were returning, that Japan was losing, that the world outside still remembered them. But hope was dangerous in places built to crush it. Disease took more than hunger did. The Red Cross parcels had stopped coming months ago, intercepted or stolen. Graves grew in neat rows behind the latrine, each marked by bamboo sticks and pieces of tin engraved with spoons. Some graves held names. Most did not. A woman named Elise wrote each death in a secret notebook, hidden inside a hollow bamboo pole near the fence. "If we die here," she wrote, "someone will know that we lived first." The guards grew harsher as Japan's fortunes faded. Beatings became routine, accusations of espionage, absurd and cruel. A woman caught speaking English was forced to kneel for 12 hours under the sun. Another, suspected of stealing rice, was tied to a post while her daughter watched. The cruelty wasn't personal, it was bureaucratic. Yet the women refused to surrender the last thing they owned, dignity. When one of them fainted, others held her upright during roll call so no one would be punished for falling. When a child died, they sang the same lullaby for hours, soft enough that the guards couldn't hear. It was not a cry of grief, it was a promise. Outside the camps, the war was already turning. American bombers had flattened Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In distant headquarters, generals argued over surrender. But in the Indies, no one told the prisoners. They still rose before dawn, still bowed before the flag, still whispered prayers over empty bowls. Then, one humid morning in August, the guards changed. Their voices were quieter, their tempers strange. The women noticed the silence first. The drills stopped, the shouts faded. A single rumor moved through the camp like wind: Japan had fallen. At first, no one believed it. If it were true, Johanna said, someone would have told us. But 2 days later, a young Japanese sergeant walked to the fence and set down his rifle. Without a word, he bowed deeply to the women, tears streaking the dust on his face. It was the first time they saw a guard bow to them. Then he left, disappearing into the jungle. For hours, no one spoke. The war had ended, but the prisoners did not know what peace meant anymore. When the gates finally opened, the world felt unreal. The women stepped beyond the fence and found sunlight painful, air too free. They saw the camp from the outside for the first time, just a few rows of huts swallowed by grass and vines. Some collapsed to their knees, unable to move. Others searched the horizon, expecting someone, anyone, to come. But the jungle was silent, the road empty. Liberation, it turned out, was not a moment. It was a waiting. Days passed before Allied planes appeared overhead, their wings glinting like silver fish. They dropped leaflets and supplies, crates of food, medicine, even soap. The women tore them open with trembling hands, laughing and crying at the sight of canned milk and white bread. Yet even as they ate, their faces held confusion. Who would they be now, after surviving so long in chains? As night fell over the ruins of the camp, one of the children, barefoot, hair tangled, eyes too old for her years, found a flower blooming near the fence. A single white frangipani, untouched by the months of rain. She plucked it carefully and brought it to Johanna. The older woman stared at it for a long time before whispering, "It smells like before." Around them, the jungle hummed softly, indifferent and alive. Somewhere far beyond the trees, American boots were landing on wet earth, heading their way, men who carried rations, bandages, and news of peace. But what those soldiers would bring, none of the women could yet imagine. And so they waited by the broken fence, holding a single white flower between their hands, unaware that within days, strangers would arrive who would see them not as prisoners, but as women again. The first time they saw the Americans, it felt like the jungle itself had split open to let them through. The airfield outside Batavia shimmered in the afternoon heat, and out of the rising dust came the deep growl of engines unlike anything the women had heard in years. A formation of C-47s descended through the clouds, their silver bellies flashing in the sunlight. Soldiers poured out, sunburnt, broad-shouldered, smelling of fuel, tobacco, and life. They were loud, laughing, too full of color for a place that had forgotten it. The Dutch women, gaunt and barefoot, stood frozen at the edge of the camp, unsure whether these men were real or part of the same dream that had carried them through starvation. Corporal James, Jimmy Alvarez, was among the first off the transport. 23 years old, from Kansas, with freckles across his nose and an accent thick as warm bread. He'd expected danger, maybe Japanese stragglers in the trees. What he found instead were eyes, hundreds of hollow eyes staring back at him through barbed wire. He stopped walking. The laughter died behind him. One of the women, her dress nothing but rags and rope, raised her hand as if asking permission to exist. He took off his helmet and set it down. "Ma'am," he whispered, "we're here to take you home." No one moved. The interpreter, an Indonesian boy in a torn Dutch uniform, shouted something, and the women began to understand. The war was over. The Japanese were gone. The Allies had come. But the realization did not bring joy, not immediately. Instead, the women began to cry, softly at first, then in waves, the kind of sobs that come from a place too deep to name. The soldiers hesitated, unsure what to do. Then one man, Private Miller, knelt and handed a can of condensed milk through the wire. A woman took it with both hands, clutching it to her chest like a relic. That small gesture broke the silence. Within minutes, soldiers were passing chocolate bars, cigarettes, and tins of meat through the fence, as if trying to make up for 3 years of hunger with whatever they carried. Some of the women laughed between tears. Others trembled. They were not used to being looked at without suspicion. Their hair was cropped short, their teeth loose from malnutrition, their skin mottled from tropical sores. Yet when the Americans spoke to them, slowly, gently, using fragments of Dutch they'd picked up from a leaflet or a comrade's girlfriend, the women's faces changed. "You are free now," they said. The words sounded foreign, almost cruel in their beauty. When the gates opened, the world tilted. The women stepped out, shielding their eyes from the light. The soldiers stared, not at ghosts or victims, but at survivors. Sergeant Riley, a medic from Chicago, removed his field cap and muttered, "Holy Mother of God, they're just girls." Some were older, some mothers, some little more than children, yet each carried herself with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had learned not to break. Riley reached into his pack and pulled out a handful of wild hibiscus he'd plucked along the airstrip that morning. He handed them to a trembling woman named Johanna, the same who once tied her husband's hair to her wrist in the camp. The petals brushed her fingertips, and she began to sob. For 3 years she had touched nothing that hadn't belonged to her captors. Word spread quickly among the American unit. The Indies girls, they called them, half in jest, half in reverence. The soldiers brought blankets, soap, even lipstick from abandoned Japanese stores. They joked awkwardly, calling the women Miss, as though trying to restore a courtesy the war had erased. Some of them, boys barely out of high school, offered to marry the women on the spot, half serious, half enchanted. They wrote their names on scraps of paper, pressed flowers between them, and said things like, "You'd like Kansas. Flat as a pancake, but I'll build you a house." The women smiled for the first time in years. Medical officers documented everything. Allied reports from September 1945 recorded severe malnutrition, psychological exhaustion, and moral collapse among female internees in Java and Sumatra. But the reports did not capture the sound of laughter returning. Nor did they note how the women began to hum as they washed, how they braided each other's hair again, or how the scent of soap in the air brought tears faster than any memory. For a brief moment, the camp that had been a place of death became a place of color. American uniforms against tropical green, Dutch prayers whispered over coffee tins, the rustle of dresses sewn from parachute silk. At night, the soldiers sat by fires and listened to the women's stories. They heard about the punishments, the hunger, the children lost to fever. They heard how some guards had wept when they left, ashamed of what they'd done. It was the first time many Americans understood that the Pacific War had not only been fought on beaches but in kitchens, hospitals, and prisons. The brutality was everywhere, yet so was the will to live. "You folks are tougher than any Marine," Jimmy Alvarez told them, and meant it. But beyond the camp's glow, the land itself was changing. The Japanese surrender had left a vacuum, and Indonesian fighters, young, angry, newly armed, were beginning to take control of the towns. The Dutch flag, once a symbol of empire, was now a target. The women who had survived Japanese captivity were suddenly in danger again, caught between a past they didn't choose and a future that no longer recognized them. American command ordered rapid evacuations. "Get them out before nightfall," Riley muttered, scanning the horizon. Gunfire echoed from the distant hills. As trucks lined up, the women climbed aboard with whatever strength remained. Some carried the flowers they'd been given. Others clutched the hands of soldiers who promised they'd write, though both knew they wouldn't. One girl, no older than 16, pressed a note into Jimmy's palm. It was written in shaky Dutch. "Dank je, America, for seeing us." He folded it carefully into his jacket pocket, where it stayed for the rest of his life. By sunset, the convoy rumbled toward Batavia, past rice fields burning with revolution. Behind them, the camp collapsed under the weight of its own history. Ahead lay hospitals, refugee centers, and more chaos. Freedom had arrived wearing an American uniform, but it was fragile, uncertain, and already under threat. When night fell, Johanna sat in the back of a truck beside other women wrapped in army blankets. The hibiscus Riley had given her lay in her lap, bruised but still red. She looked up at the stars, real stars unguarded by wire, and whispered something in Dutch that no one could hear. Jimmy, sitting across from her, met her eyes and smiled, the kind of quiet, tired smile that belonged only to those who'd seen too much. For a brief moment, neither war nor empire existed, only two strangers suspended between ruin and rebirth. Then the truck lurched to a stop. From somewhere in the dark ahead came the crack of distant gunfire. The soldiers stiffened, engines idled, and a radio hissed with static. The women clutched each other, hearts pounding. Freedom, it seemed, had come with a price, and the night was not yet done collecting it. Jakarta was no longer a city, it was a fuse. In the months after Japan's surrender, the tropical air itself seemed charged with something raw and dangerous. Red and white flags, hand-sewn, defiant, rose from rooftops that still carried the black scars of Allied bombing. The Dutch called it chaos. The Indonesians called it freedom. And the newly arrived Americans found themselves standing in the middle of a country that was no longer anyone's to command. When Johanna stepped off the truck at the Allied Repatriation Center, she was still clutching the wilted hibiscus in her hand. Behind her, hundreds of women filed in under the protection of U.S. soldiers, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Ahead, the once grand colonial building had been stripped bare, its marble floors now covered with blood-stained stretchers and Red Cross banners. Outside, Indonesian youth militias patrolled the streets with stolen Japanese rifles. They were barely older than the American soldiers, but their eyes held something harder, the fire of a nation being born. Corporal Jimmy Alvarez watched them from the compound gate. He had been assigned to assist with civilian extractions, a phrase that sounded clean on paper but was anything but. Rumors of violence were everywhere. Dutch civilians dragged from homes, Chinese shopkeepers lynched, Allied convoys attacked. The British command called it the Bersiap period, be prepared, but no one was. Jimmy had fought through Okinawa, yet this was different. There were no front lines, only neighbors turning on neighbors. And in the middle of it all were the Dutch women who had already survived one war and now faced another they didn't understand. Inside the compound, Johanna sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the chaos outside. She could hear chanting in the distance, a rising chorus of Merdeka. Merdeka! Freedom! Freedom! The word was beautiful and terrible all at once. She didn't hate them, the young Indonesians waving rifles in the street. How could she? She had seen what being powerless felt like. But she also knew they saw her not as a survivor but as a symbol of the old empire they despised. Her blonde hair and pale skin were no longer marks of privilege, only targets. That night, gunfire crackled across the city. A group of Indonesian youths stormed a nearby warehouse, believing it to be a Dutch outpost. The Americans responded with warning shots, trying to avoid bloodshed. Jimmy was sent to guard the perimeter. In the flickering light of burning oil drums, he saw shadows darting through the alleyways, heard the sound of a woman crying somewhere beyond the wall. He raised his rifle, then lowered it. Nothing in training prepared him for a war that had no uniforms. By dawn, smoke hung heavy over Batavia's canals. The radio crackled with half-truths and orders. Evacuate European civilians. Do not engage unless fired upon. Trucks filled with Dutch families crawled through the city, escorted by tanks that had once fought in Burma. Children clutched stuffed animals. Mothers kept their eyes forward. And yet, amid the panic, small acts of humanity bloomed. An Indonesian nurse smuggled medicine to the Dutch women's ward. A local family left food at the compound gate despite the risk. Compassion survived in the cracks, as it always does when ideology tries to erase it. Johanna began to volunteer in the makeshift infirmary. She helped clean wounds, boiled water, held feverish children through the night. The Americans respected her quiet steadiness, her refusal to crumble again. You're tougher than all of us, Jimmy told her once as they loaded the wounded onto stretchers. She smiled faintly. Toughness is just what's left when fear runs out. The words stayed with him. The camp grew overcrowded. Disease returned, malaria, dysentery, the familiar smell of rot. Food rations dwindled. The soldiers slept with their boots on. Sometimes at night, the women heard distant singing from the Indonesian lines, patriotic hymns rising over the jungle. It wasn't hatred, it was hope, weaponized. And deep down, Johanna understood it. They were fighting for the same thing she had once prayed for behind the barbed wire, a life that belonged to no one else. One evening, as the sun fell blood-red over the harbor, Jimmy found her sitting alone by the fence, staring at the smoke curling from the city. You should rest, he said gently. She shook her head. You ever feel like the world keeps ending, but no one notices? He didn't answer. He just sat beside her, the scent of salt and ash between them. In another world, they might have been two strangers meeting in peace. Here, they were two survivors in borrowed time. The next morning brought chaos. A convoy of Allied trucks was ambushed outside Bandung, 40 miles south. Rumors spread fast. Massacres, hostages, missing soldiers. The Americans were ordered to retreat from isolated zones and focus on evacuation. All non-combatants to the docks, barked the command. We're pulling out within the week. The Dutch women wept quietly as they packed what little they owned. They'd been liberated, yes, but not saved. Freedom, it seemed, was a moving line that never held still. At the harbor, the scene was biblical. Thousands pressed toward the ships under a burning sky. British Gurkhas tried to keep order, shouting over the roar of engines. Women clutched papers, names of missing husbands, bags filled with photographs and soap. Johanna stood near the ramp, her hands shaking as she turned to look for Jimmy. He was somewhere in the crowd, directing the wounded, his uniform stained with oil and sweat. Their eyes met for a moment across the chaos. Neither waved. Neither needed to. Some bonds existed quietly, without promise or farewell. When her turn came, Johanna hesitated. Behind her, the island stretched endless and green. She thought of the Indonesians chanting Merdeka, of the Japanese sergeant who had bowed before leaving, of the American boy who'd handed her a flower. Every face carried its own truth, its own reason for fighting. There were no villains left, only survivors, each clutching their piece of broken history. She stepped onto the ship, the plank creaking under her bare feet. As the vessel pulled away, she watched the coastline shrink to a blur of smoke and palms. On shore, gunfire still echoed. Someone near her whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed softly in Dutch. Johanna said nothing. She touched the hibiscus folded in her pocket, dry now, almost crumbling, and felt the sting of salt air on her skin. For the first time, she wondered if the flower's color had ever truly been red, or if she had only imagined it that way. On deck, Jimmy leaned against a crate, staring back at the island that refused to stay still. He had orders to escort the refugees only as far as Singapore, then return. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, or if history would remember any of them. But as night fell over the Java Sea, he felt something shift, a quiet certainty that wars might end on paper, but never in the human heart. Lightning flashed on the horizon, illuminating the coastline one last time before darkness swallowed it. Somewhere behind that veil, 1,000 others were still waiting, caught between old flags and new. The sea rolled beneath them, endless and unbothered, as if it too had grown tired of remembering. And in that silence between thunder and dawn, the islands themselves seemed to breathe, restless, wounded, and not yet free. By 1947, the world was trying to forget the war, but some memories refused to stay buried. In the Netherlands, the canals still glimmered under bridges rebuilt with foreign aid, and the scent of tulips returned to the air like a promise. Yet beneath that spring calm lay ghosts. Thousands of repatriates from the Dutch East Indies arriving by ship, carrying not luggage, but the weight of everything they'd endured. Among them was Johanna, her face leaner, her eyes older, stepping down the gangway into a country she no longer recognized. The port at Rotterdam was crowded with uniformed officials, nurses, and families clutching photographs. Some women collapsed the moment their feet touched home soil. Others walked straight into the waiting arms of husbands who had thought them dead. But many, like Johanna, had no one waiting. Their houses had been requisitioned, their families scattered, their accents marked them as colonial, a word now whispered with disdain in post-war Europe. Freedom had been granted, but belonging had not. In her coat pocket, Johanna still carried the pressed hibiscus Riley had given her 2 years earlier. Its petals had turned brittle and brown, but its scent, faint, powdery, remained. At night, in a refugee dormitory outside The Hague, she would unfold it carefully and hold it to her nose, closing her eyes to remember the sound of the rain in Java, the laughter of the American soldiers, and the way one of them, Jimmy, had smiled as if he saw her for who she was, not what the war had made her. The Dutch government called the returning women Indisch repatrianten. They were processed, interviewed, given ration cards and temporary housing. Newspapers published photos of them stepping off ships, "Our daughters return." But behind the headlines was silence. Few wanted to hear about the camp. The polite thing was to move on, to rebuild. Trauma was unseemly. Johanna took work at a hospital laundry, folding the white sheets of others who were beginning again. She did it quietly, mechanically, grateful at least to have work. Letters arrived occasionally from the Indies, passed through Red Cross channels. Some bore familiar handwriting, others from strangers offering fragments of closure. A brother found alive in Surabaya, a child adopted by missionaries, a husband's name listed on a casualty roster. Johanna never received word of hers. But one day, among the letters, came a small parcel postmarked from San Francisco. Inside was a single photograph, an American in uniform standing beside a Pacific Coast highway, the ocean behind him, and beneath it, a note written in careful Dutch. Still thinking of the woman who smelled of rain and courage. J. She traced the letters with her finger, tears blurring the ink. The world was vast again, and yet somehow still intimate. Years passed. The war receded into textbooks and documentaries, its survivors fading into the background of a modernizing Europe. But in quiet corners, the stories persisted. Women like Johanna began to gather in cafes and church basements, telling each other what no one else would listen to. They spoke of starvation, of captivity, of kindness in the unlikeliest faces. They remembered the Japanese guard who bowed, the Indonesian nurse who risked her life, the American boy who gave flowers. Through their voices, memory bloomed again, not as history but as healing. In 1950, Johanna received an invitation she almost a small bundle into her hand. Inside was a fresh tulip, its stem wrapped in paper. "Couldn't find a hibiscus in this weather," he said. "But it's still a flower from me to you." She laughed softly through her tears. "Then maybe," she whispered, "the world has forgiven itself a little." In the years that followed, others like them found one another, Dutch women and American men whose fates had crossed in the ashes of empire. Some married and moved across oceans. Others carried on with memories folded in drawers beside medals and keepsakes. Johanna never remarried. But every spring, she placed a vase of tulips on her windowsill and wrote a letter she never sent, addressed only to the man who brought flowers. History would come to call their story minor, a footnote in the grand theater of war. But for those who lived it, it was the moment when humanity returned. In the archives of the Dutch Red Cross, faded photographs still survive. Women in patched dresses holding American ration tins, smiling weakly, soldiers kneeling to offer flowers through a fence. No heroism, no headlines, just small mercies that endured longer than flags or treaties. One rainy morning decades later, an old woman walked through a field of tulips outside Lies. Her hair was white now, her back bent, but her gait still steady. She stopped by a single bloom the color of sunset and bent to touch it. "You're late," she murmured, as if greeting an old friend. Then she smiled, softly, privately, as though she had heard laughter most mistook for a mistake. A formal ceremony in The Hague to honor survivors of the internment camp. She wore a simple navy dress and pinned the old hibiscus, now preserved in glass, against her lapel. The hall was filled with diplomats, veterans, and women in dark coats, their faces pale but proud. When the ceremony ended, a group of American officers approached, part of the new Marshall Plan delegation. Among them was a man with flecks of gray in his hair, a familiar steadiness in his walk. Jimmy Alvarez had grown broader in the shoulders, older around the eyes, but his smile was the same. For a moment, the noise of the hall fell away. They shook hands, both uncertain whether to speak first. "I didn't think you'd remember me," he said quietly. "I remembered everything," she replied. He laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, I told my mother once that the bravest people I met in the war weren't soldiers. She thought I was talking about Marines." Johanna smiled, eyes glistening. "Maybe you were right anyway. Marines fight to win. We fought to stay human." They walked together along the canal that evening, the city lights trembling on the water. He told her about Kansas, about the farm he'd returned to, about the letters he'd written that never found her. She spoke of the hospital, the cold winters, the silence that hung over survivors like unspoken prayer. They didn't speak of love. It was too simple a word for people who had lived through so much unspoken loss, but something passed between them, a shared understanding that the world could still surprise. When they parted, he pressed, carried on the wind from half a world away. The camera might have lingered there, on her hand brushing the petals, on the trembling light across the field, before panning upward to the gray sky. War had taken nearly everything, yet it had also given something back. The fragile proof that even in ruin, beauty can return. That kindness, once given, does not die. And somewhere in a drawer, between the pages of an old Bible, the hibiscus still rests, its color faded to sepia, its shape intact. A relic of the moment when flowers bloomed from ashes, and the world, for a heartbeat, remembered how to be gentle again.